Hey, remember Firebreather? Well, I remember Firebreather. But for those who don't know what Firebreather is, Firebreather was a comic series and a TV movie from around 2000 to 2010. But if you do know what Firebreather is, you probably have some questions about the series. For example, why were the comics never finished? Why was the movie CGI? And why did Firebreather never get a TV series? Well, in this video, I answered all those questions and more. But the real reason I made this video is I want Firebreather to come back. And I know there's a lot of you out there who want to see it come back too. But obviously, I can't bring back the series all on my own, so that's where I might need your help. And I'll discuss how that can all be done later on in the video. But first, the table of contents. So this is how the video will be laid out. So I'll start off by getting into the general background of Firebreather for those who don't know about it, and this will include a brief overview of the story and a brief overview of how the series was first started. Next up, I'll get into more detail over the comics and the movie in their own sections, and lastly, I'll talk about the petition made for the series. And this section of the video really is the most important part, so if you're not planning on watching this whole video, just do me a favor and make sure you watch this part. Alright, without any further ado, let's get this video started. Alright, so let's start with the background by talking about the story of Firebreather. So the story of Firebreather is about a 16-year-old boy named Duncan. And in this world, there are humans and there are kaiju. And the humans and kaiju have been at war for centuries. And it stayed that way until Duncan's mom met Balak. And together, they had Duncan. Now Balak, he just happens to be the king of the kaiju. Now if you're wondering how that works since Balak is the size of building, well, I'm not really too sure. In the movie, he can change form a little bit, so maybe that explains it. Just a quick note here while I'm editing. Phil Hester, the writer of the series, was going to explain how they had Duncan, but unfortunately, as I'll discuss later, he never got a chance to. Alright, now back to the video. Oh yeah, so that means Duncan is half human and half kaiju, and that goes about as well as you expect. Throughout the story, Duncan has to balance between the human world and the kaiju world. As his mom wants him to live a normal life,
you make your own choices. Except for college. You're going to college.
while Balak wants him to be the heir to the throne.
This is Duncan, my heir!
And all this is going on as Duncan gets new powers and abilities. Now, I don't want to get into the story too much here, as this is just a quick overview, but if you're interested in the story, you can find both the comics and the movie online for a relatively low price. Okay, so now you know the basic story behind Firebreather, but before we dive any deeper, let me just briefly go over how the series was first started. So Firebreather was first started as a comic miniseries back in 2003 that was published by Image Comics. And as some of you know, that's the same company that published Invincible. And Firebreather and Invincible had actually had a crossover in the past. And since they had a crossover, some people have said that they might share the same universe. But I'm not 100% sure on that, so take it with a grain of salt. And now on to the movie. The movie first started in late 2008 when it was considered by a few companies for a film, and eventually it was picked up by Cartoon Network. Not long after that, it went into production in 2009 and released in 2010. Alright, so now you know the basic info about Firebreather, so now you can move on to the next sections. So, I've got to start off by saying, I'm not the biggest comic reader myself. You know, I read your classics like your Spider-Mans and your Batmans and all that, but Firebreather was the first comic that I really got into. So if someone like me, who really isn't a big comic guy, decides to make a video about a comic series, well, I think that really speaks for how good the story is. Now, when I first saw the comics though, I was kind of surprised by different the character design was. As I watched the movie first, and to be honest, at the beginning, I wasn't the biggest fan of the comics design. The fact Duncan is half kaiju is much more evident in the comics. But you know what? I actually prefer it that way. I just feel like it makes more sense in the context. But overall, what I'm really trying to start off by saying here is that I know there's a lot of you watching who came to this video just for the movie, which is fine, but you should still give the comics a try, even if it's something completely new to you. Because trust me, the comics, they really grow on you. But enough of that introduction stuff, let's talk about who made the comics. So the comics were written by Phil Hester illustrated by Andy Kuhn, and colored by Bill Crabtree. Now what you gotta know about these guys is they have a pretty impressive history of making comics, and I'm sure you've heard of some of the comics they worked on. So Firebreather was sort of a passion project for both Phil and Andy, as they had other comics to work on at the time, but they still worked on Firebreather on the side. Now even though it did get published by Image Comics in 2003 as a miniseries, it was never really a fully paid thing. This is partially why there isn't too many issues of Firebreather in comparison to other comics. It just wasn't as financially viable. Like I said before, it really was a passion project. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this first volume of Firebreather was released in 2003, but the next year in 2004, there was a one-shot released. And if you don't know what a one-shot is, it's basically just a single issue instead of a full volume. And then Firebreather got its next full volume 4 years later in 2008, and the third volume wasn't released until after the movie in 2011. Hey, just a quick note here. So it turns out the first issue of Volume 3 was actually released the same day as the movie in 2010, and the second issue was released afterwards in 2011. However, it was never finished, with only 2 or 4 issues being released. And if you guessed the story was left on a cliffhanger, well, you'd be right, which is why it's so frustrating it never got finished. What makes it even worse is that Firebreather was meant to have a 12-issue origin arc, but right now, we only have 10, not including the one-shot. So only 2 issues are preventing the conclusion of Firebreather's origin, and if the origin story gets done, there could be much more opportunities for the series in general. Now I've seen in interviews and on blogs that both Phil and Andy had much more planned for Firebreather. Phil mentioned in an interview that he wanted to make at least 4 volumes, and looking back at Andy's blog, he looked very excited to work on the series more. So I'm not really sure what happened. It seemed like the last 2 issues of Volume 3 were almost ready to be released, as both the covers seemed to be done, and it looked like they had more planned after the 3rd volume. But if I had to guess what happened, I would say they probably got other offers they just couldn't refuse. Now admittedly, it's been a long time since the last volume was released, but Firebreather, it still has a lot of potential in it, and I definitely do think the creators still care about it. And if any of the creators happen to watch this video, I hope this serves as some sort of inspiration or motivation to get back to work on the series, as it's never too late, and I don't think it deserves to just sit unfinished the rest of the time. But if you want to do something too, there are 2 options here, and luckily it's much easier to get your voice heard for the comics versus a multi-billion-dollar film studio. So the first option is to just tell the creators they want to see more. But please, if you decide to do this option, just promise me you won't harass them or spam them in any way, as I said earlier, they are still busy working on other things. And the second option, which is the preferred option, is a petition I made, and I'll discuss this more near the end of the video. Whenever I used to look back on a Firebreather movie, I always thought I might have been looking back at the rose-tinted glasses. I thought that until pretty recently when I rewatched the movie, and I gotta say, held up pretty well, and it's still pretty good. So as I mentioned earlier, the movie was released in 2010, and it was produced by Cartoon Network, and it was made to be a TV movie / pilot episode, and if the movie did well, there would have been a possibility for more Firebreather in the future, in the form of a series or a sequel. And the movie did turn out really well, but it wasn't perfect. Some of the writing had to be toned down to fit Cartoon Network, which led to some awkward moments.
Holy hello, kid.
But overall it was pretty good, and I think the use of CGI was very well done, especially for the time and budget, but it has its moments that kind of take you out of it. And if you didn't know, Firebreather is actually Cartoon Network's first, and so far only, original CGI movie. Now, even with its minor flaws, I'm glad they chose to use CGI instead of 2D. It's obvious they put in a lot of effort into the CGI, and even though the movie was made in 2010, the CGI is actually a lot better than some of the stuff we see today.
Oh my goodness!
The use of CGI just makes the whole movie feel a little more special, you know? And I think it's partially why I remember it so well. With all that being said though, the CGI inadvertently caused the movie some problems. For starters, I know there's a few people out there who just don't like to use the CGI, especially TV movie CGI. But even if you feel that way, which I understand, I still think you should give the movie a try, because it might just surprise you. But the main problem though with the CGI was the cost. Today a CGI movie can be whipped up pretty cheap and turn out pretty good, most of the time. But in 2010, good CGI was just more expensive. That's the main reason why Cartoon Network continued Firebreather. Despite its good reception, Cartoon Network just couldn't justify the cost, as they didn't want to spend so much money on something they technically didn't even own, as they just produced it. And one thing to note here is when they were first making the movie, they actually had a few ideas for the art style. And one of those ideas was for an animated movie, and the video playing in the background is actually the concept art that was drawn up for it. But as we know though, they didn't end up using animation, they went with CGI, which I still feel like was the best option, but makes you wonder, would we have had a series or maybe even a sequel that had been animated instead, since it would have been cheaper in CGI to make. Now I mentioned earlier that the movie had a good reception, but how did the movie actually do? Well, the premiere alone attracted 3.7 million viewers, which is already a pretty good amount. It was also the #1 telecast that day across all kids and teen networks. Now today, over 13 years later, the reviews are mostly positive, with some fair criticisms, but an overwhelming amount of user reviews are positive and mention how Firebreather should have been a series. And of course I agree with that statement. Now every good movie though has a good team behind it, and this movie was no different. It was directed by Peter Chung, who you might have heard from Aeon Flux. It was written by Jim Krieg, who's written a lot of Warner Bros. And DC movies in the past. And the voice actors for the movie also did a pretty good job as well. There were a few parts that felt a little forced.
You really are the king of the jerkwads.
It's good to be the king!
But overall, it's done really well, especially for a TV movie. And some of the cast includes Kevin Michael Richardson, Dante Basco, and Jesse Head. And of course, these are just a few people who worked in the movie, but the whole crew did an amazing job. It's no surprise the movie turned out so well. I mean, it even got 2 Emmys. Now how come Firebreather even got a movie in the first place, with it being a relatively small comic series? Well, it's mostly thanks to Julie Pastor and her production company. If you've never heard of Julie Pastor, I'm sure you've heard some of the movies she's helped produce. Movies like Nacho Libre, Lemony Snicket, and even the first SpongeBob movie. So yeah, she's no amateur when it comes to producing. The movie concept was first found at Paramount 2008, who didn't do much with it, and eventually their option period expired. Julia though recognized Firebreather for what it is, and she said it was too good to just let it die. So she personally pushed Firebreather through Hollywood until eventually it ended up in Cartoon Network's hands. But I really gotta say thanks to Julie Pastor though. Without her, Firebreather never could have had a chance to be made. But I think the movie was a victim of its time. Like I said, in 2010, good CGI was just too expensive to make on a regular basis. And to be honest, Cartoon Network was making some weird decisions at the time. And plus, in 2010, kaiju stories and things like that were basically unknown to most people. Today though, CGI is cheaper to make. And stories like Firebreather have practically blown up on streaming services. So I think now is a great time for Firebreather to return. Doesn't have to be CGI, doesn't have to be a full series, a movie sequel would work just fine. And it doesn't even have to be Cartoon Network either. It's possible it could be picked up by another studio, but the concept alone is just really something special, and it deserves at least something else. If you disagree with me though, and you think it's a waste of time to try and bring back Firebreather, go watch the movie, then come back here. Cause I guarantee you'll change your mind. Seriously, you can find Firebreather on Amazon for only $3. Go check it out. Now, with all that being said, is it even possible to bring Firebreather back to the screen? Well, it won't be too easy, but there are a few reasons I think it could happen. I know I already said before that Cartoon Network doesn't have to be the one to make it again, and that's still true, but it would be simpler if they did, since they already made the first one. Really, the only reason I think it's possible with Cartoon Network is because the new president seems pretty good. He's mentioned that he does want to bring back smaller stuff, so we'll see. Another reason I think it's possible is because from what I've seen, most of the film crew enjoyed working on Firebreather. They too thought they were going to make more after the movie. I mean, the director Peter Chung still posts references to it to this day, so it might not be too hard to bring that together again. But if that's not possible, which probably isn't, that's okay. Because what really matters the most here is the concept of a Firebreather show or movie. I mean, if the Cartoon Network TV movie turned out this well, could you imagine how good it could be with a better budget and more time? I think if studios knew about that, there would probably be a few out there who would want to make more Firebreather. So what can we do about it? Well, really, there's two ways I could think of. Now, you know before, how I mentioned you shouldn't harass or spam the comic creators on social media? Well, that's true for them. But big movie studios on the other hand, that's the story. So, go on social media and let the studios know that you want to see more Firebreather. Don't be scared to reply to every post the studios make. I'm thinking Cartoon Network, HBO Max, Amazon's a good one, Paramount, really, whatever you prefer. Understandably though, if you don't want to do that, I have a much easier and simpler option.
Would you please sign my petition?
Sorry, yo.
You gotta be f***ing kidding.
That's right. As I mentioned a few times in this video, I made a petition. And actually, I made 2 petitions. One for the comic and one for the movies. The comic petition is really just there to serve as motivation for the comic creators to show that there's still people out there who want to see more. And the movie petition is probably the best chance we have to bring Firebreather back to the screen. If we all rally behind this petition, it's possible we might be able to catch the attention of a big producer or a big studio. Now I know what you're thinking. I can't be bothered to do all that. But trust me, it really isn't that much work. Even if you don't have a change.org account, it won't take you more than a minute to go sign them. In fact, it's so easy and so quick that by the time I'm done saying all these words here, you could have signed it already. So go right now into the description and go sign them, because this really is the best chance we have. Hey, I just wanted to say a few things here before the video ends. First off, thanks for watching. I really do appreciate you making this far into the video. And if you happen to be someone who worked on Firebreather, whether it be the comics or the movie, thank you. Thank you for making Firebreather so great. And I hope you all enjoyed the video because, well, this is the first video I've ever made, so it might not have been perfect, but it definitely took me a while. Also, one last thing, the petitions, just do me a favor and go sign those. You've already made it this far into the video, so might as well just go do it real fast. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I have some bonus clips on the end card here in a few seconds, if you want to stick around for those. And here's hoping we see more Firebreather again sometime soon. Take care.